Welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Today I think I'm talking about an obvious topic, but hopefully putting a not quite so obvious spin on it. And that is whether the Rolex price bubble has burst. We've seen Adrian at Buck and Jack go reasonably hard on the fact that he thinks the bubble has burst. And we've seen a much stronger response from Paul Thorpe saying that that's rubbish, and perhaps going so far as to say Adrian was irresponsible in his video. Now, frankly, I think Paul Thorpe's, who I've got an enormous amount of time for, by the way, but I think Paul's gone totally over the top here. The idea that Adrian can somehow affect the prices of a global behemoth like Rolex kind of doesn't make sense to me, but that's beside the point. I think that if you take a more global view, the impact that Adrian's video would have on the market as opposed to the other way around is minuscule. But put that to one side. What I want to talk about is what my perception is of this Rolex price bubble in the first place, and what I think when I see what Watchbox is doing in significantly reducing the markups it has on some of its Rolex stock. What do I think is going on? So the first thing I need to do before I go on is say where I think Rolex actually sits in the market. And this could be itself quite controversial. Rolex is not one of the heavy hitters in the luxury market. That's my position. Fundamentally, my position is that Rolex is, at its core, a middle-class brand. It's a brand which has some true luxury items, but which fundamentally markets itself towards middle-class people. This is a brand which is fundamentally attainable by people on a normal income. Now, some of you are going to gag completely when I talk about Rolex being more of a middle class rather than a luxury watch brand. For many of you, for many of us, for me before I got involved in watches, Rolex was the very epitome of luxury. To have a Rolex was to have a luxury product. The more I've got invested in this community and the more I've studied the way it works, and the more I've thought about sort of branding and social power across the board, I've come to believe that is not what Rolex at its core really is. What Rolex does, and what it does, which is almost unique in the watch world, is present an aspirational kind of luxury, which at the same time is kind of useful and defendable and has a rationale that someone from a good working class or middle class background can point to justify their purchase. Now, I've referred to this book before, The Taste, The Secret Meaning of Things, which is an economic and sociological analysis of brands. And there's a whole section where they talk specifically about Rolex, and I've mentioned that before in another video. I'm not going to go through it all now, but there's one key paragraph that I'll put the words up on the screen and I'll read it to you. It is significant that Rolex users are so self-conscious about their choice of wristwatch, and that to many of them its value lies either in its overt expression of professionalism or its reticent expression of neutrality. The proper maintenance of the middle class's self-regard depends on their values being necessarily good, superior to those of the upper as well as the lower classes. This is why snobbery is essentially a distinction of the middle class, and why Rolex is essentially a middle class watch. And that's what I mean by when I talk about Rolex being a middle class watch. The tool watch aesthetics, the tool watch idea that's at the core of Rolex grounds it, makes it something which we in the middle classes, we that don't, aren't the Paris Hiltons, aren't the Justin Biebers of the world, aren't rap stars, can point to and justify to ourselves that this is a tool that we can feel good about spending thousands of dollars on. Here's the rub though. There's a ceiling to how far people like we can go in spending money on a watch. There's a point at which we no longer can afford to support that habit. And Rolex has been, the Rolex secondary market, those prices are hitting that ceiling. If at the point where a basic dive watch is starting to hit 12,000, 13,000 US dollars, there's a reason there's not a lot of other competitors to that watch. It's because there's not much of a market for a $14,000, $15,000 tool watch. Once you start getting beyond that, you start getting into Royal Oak, Patek, Vacheron overseas space. That's when the tooly as parts of it start to fall away and we start moving into true luxury goods, when we no longer feel that we have to justify that we're spending all this money buying a 300-meter dive watch, and we're comfortable with the idea that we're buying a sports styled piece of pure luxury that actually isn't that robust. So the Rolex prices on things like a GMT, on things like a Submariner, really don't have a market problem. They have a demographic problem. There simply is no one to sell that watch those competitors to. I actually tried doing this on a Facebook post. I asked people. Now the 50 fathoms falls to that price range. And I do find it interesting that Blancpain actually finds it quite difficult to sell a lot of watches at the full retail that a 50 fathoms would have. It falls back into the same price range that Rolex can't really get past, which again tells me something about what the market will bear for an obvious tool watch in this sort of luxury segment. So when I went to Facebook and I asked, what are some other competitors that people might come up with? The first response I got was, someone in that market with that money to spend doesn't buy a watch. They go buy something completely different, like a Porsche. There's probably a lot of truth to that. If you started talking about, when you pressed and looked at some of the next responses, the responses were not dive watches. The responses were a Breguet Type 20 or an IWC pilot's watch. What I found really interesting was most people could not identify another watch which would charge that kind of money for that style of watch. The one exception was Panerai. Panerai got mentioned a lot, which is really interesting because, again, that is an iconic watch which is incredibly popular, which they do try and sell above this sort of Rolex price range of above 12,000 US. But if you look at the Carbotech, if you look at the prices you get on the ceramics, they on the secondary market fall heavily, like the 50 fathoms, back into this $12,000 to $15,000 range. That seems to be about as much as most people are prepared to pay for this style of watch. So what's my take on whether the Rolex bubble has burst? I don't think it has. What I think is that Rolex is now hovering, those steel Rolexes that we're all talking about, so that's Explorers, Explorer 2s, GMTs, Submariners, they're all kind of at the maximum that market segment will bear. They're just, what we're seeing is, if you like, some natural expansion and contraction around the edges of what that market will expect. And so if you look at Watchbox, I think all they did was they pushed their prices a little bit beyond what the market would bear. And what you're seeing now is that they are falling back into line with probably where that, if you like, horizon, that price horizon is for a Rolex watch. So what does that mean for the future? I think it'll probably stay where it is. I think there's been a number of people. I'm not really saying anything new. I think the guys from Scottish Watches have been saying something similar. The prices of Rolexes have probably stabilized about where they would be, and that what you're really going to see now are just some minor perturbations based on normal cost of living increases, and maybe some small things around the edges about individual sellers and individual buyers making decisions to pull the trigger on very small batches. So I don't think you're going to see massive price rises or massive price falls. What I would say is what Watchbox has done has indicated that their prices were beyond what the market would take, and they're settling back into a more market-friendly envelope. So that's it. That's my take on the price bubble for Rolex. We're seeing the normal inflation and deflation around the maximum that market will bear. No big deal. We may see some more pressure come out of it depending on where people have priced their industry, but I do not see a pop coming. And the other thing too is, I suppose I haven't really stressed it, is this is a long-term global issue around the very market segment that Rolex tries to see itself in. It is not a response to Brexit. It is not a response to Hong Kong. I don't believe this is a transitory thing. This is pretty much where Rolex is going to be until something really significant happens, and fundamentally, and I'm not saying a minor recession here or there, we're saying a worldwide depression or a worldwide shift in tastes. I can't see much happening to Rolex prices outside of these minor perturbations for the next 5 to 10 years. So that's my take on Rolex prices and where we're going. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Stick them in the comments below. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Card's going to come up a little while with my contact details and my Instagram handle. I've been advised I should be trying to pump up my my Instagram likes or my Instagram follows. So go over, check me out there, pump it. Follow me or like me or whatever that you do on Instagram. Please subscribe to my channel. It has grown. I have cracked 2,000 subscribers, so I'm still a tiny little minnow in the YouTube community, much less the watch community. But it is nice to see it still growing. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later. Bye.